Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to you all to today's webinar, hosted in partnership with Philanthropy California. We're so glad you've joined us. My name is Sarah Martin, and I'm the Manager of Programming and External Relations at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. The theme for today's discussion is what funders need to know, the state of nonprofits and grantee well-being. In today's program, we'll ground ourselves in the data from CEP's second annual State of Nonprofits report, part of our Nonprofit Voice project series, as well as our recent research snapshot about how foundations are supporting grantee well-being. For those of you tuning in who are new to CEP, I'd love to share a bit about us. Our work is focused on philanthropic effectiveness, and for over 2 decades, we've sought to help foundations and increasingly individual donors to improve their effectiveness and increase their impact. We do this through assessments and research reports that often lift up the perspectives of those who wouldn't otherwise be heard, as well as programs like this one. We are a nonprofit and rely on grants and contributions to support our research and programs, so please reach out if you're interested in supporting us. Our calendar for opting into a round of grantee, donor, or staff surveys and assessments is nearly full this year, so also please reach out if you work at a grant maker and would like to learn more about them. Next, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we are in webinar format, which means all of you are muted and have your videos off. If you have questions for the panelists during today's presentation, and we really hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. We'll try to be as responsive as possible to as many questions as we can during the Q&A towards the end of the program. We will not be using the hand-raising function on the webinar as we are not asking attendees to speak their questions. And if you do require any kind of technical assistance, please reach out to my colleague, Say Darling, at saed@cep.org. We'll also be sharing some resources with you via the chat box, so feel free to check there for helpful links. If you'd like to enable closed captioning, you can do so in your Zoom control panel by clicking More and Captioning. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to all registrants in a follow-up email. We will also include links to the resources you hear about today in that follow-up email. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, I'm really excited to pass it to Carla Mercado, Director of Philanthropy California, our partner for today's webinar, to share a brief welcome. Carla?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Mercado, she, her, hers, and I am the Director of Philanthropy California. As the name states, we are located in California, and our state is very large, complex, and diverse, as well as innovative. And because of that, we have 3 regional associations in our state. There's Northern California Grantmakers, Southern California Grantmakers, and Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties. In 2017, we decided that it's imperative that we talk about not just the issues and solutions that our members and our communities are working on at a regional level, but also at a statewide level, which is how the statewide partnership of Philanthropy California was formed. Philanthropy California has a couple focus areas that we talk about, and we bring our regional expertise. We bring in the innovation and the complexities of how we deal with them and how we're finding solutions. And these focus areas are obviously advancing equity and gender justice, building an inclusive democracy, climate disaster preparedness and resiliency, as well as nonprofit sustainability. Again, we talk about these issues both from a regional perspective, but also how they impact the state, and also how we may lend some of our input to national conversations. In our work around nonprofit sustainability, we talk about how to support nonprofits to ensure that they have the resources that they need to do the work that they do in our communities day in and day out. And in our conversations with our partners, with community leaders, we have found that the conversation is beyond resources. The conversation also focuses on the well-being of staff. Each of our regional associations is a nonprofit. And as nonprofit leaders, we bring in our lived experiences, our various identities, and that plays a role in how we show up at the work. And we want to make sure that our nonprofit leaders are supported. And because of that, when CEP approached us with this report and this partnership, we were immensely just filled with gratitude that at the national level, this is also being elevated. Not to forget that we are approaching a pretty tumultuous season in the year. Elections tend to pivot organizations to focus on various issues all at once. And once again, what impact does that have on the staff? And we want to make sure that this support is not just cyclical, that it's year-round, and not just 1 or 2 years, but consistently. So we're very excited to partner with CEP, and we're very, as I mentioned, grateful for their leadership. And with that, I will hand it off to Alicia Smith Arrillaga, who is going to provide an overview of the report and kick us off. So Alicia, off to you.
Thank you so much, Carla. And I am super excited to share with you today the results of CEP's State of Nonprofits Report 2024. Now, this first report that we're presenting today, we initially started this annual report series to do 3 main things. First, to take the pulse of nonprofit leaders who are receiving foundation funding. Second, to examine change over time and leaders' experiences and perspectives. And third, to help both individual and institutional funders understand the experiences of the nonprofits that they fund. CEP is especially well positioned to do that thanks to our long-running Nonprofit Voice Project, or MVP. So what is the MVP exactly? The Nonprofit Voice Project aims to elevate the nonprofit experience for institutional and individual funders to inform how they give. To do that, every 2 to 4 years, we assemble a nationally representative sample of leaders of US-based nonprofits that receive funding from private foundations that give $5 million or more annually. This is our second year surveying this particular group of CEOs, executive directors, and other nonprofit leaders, giving us the opportunity to begin looking at change over time. We are also very grateful to the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, McKnight Foundation, and Rita Allen Foundation for their support of this research. For this year's State of Nonprofits, we surveyed 463 eligible members of our Nonprofit Voice Project sample earlier this year. We heard from 239 nonprofit leaders, representing a 52% response rate. From these leaders' perspectives, we've gathered 3 key findings, which I'll be talking you through today. Our first key finding is that burnout for both nonprofit staff and leadership remains a top concern for most nonprofit leaders, with half of nonprofit leaders feeling more concerned about their own burnout than this time last year. Virtually all of the leaders that we surveyed this year, 95%, expressed some level of concern about their staff's burnout. That's indicated here in dark blue. In particular, almost 70% of leaders reported to us that staff burnout was either somewhat or very much a concern. You'll notice that levels of concern about staff burnout remain largely unchanged since 2023, which is shown here in orange. Even as time passes since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, leaders are telling us the staff burnout has not let up at their organizations. And it's not just staff. This year, we also added a measure of leaders' concern about their own burnout. A large majority of leaders indicate some level of concern, and over 60% report that their own burnout is either somewhat or very much a concern. Half of the leaders we surveyed are feeling more concerned about their own burnout than this time last year. As one leader aptly put it, I have been a nonprofit leader for 20 years, and I've not experienced a reality like the one I am in currently. There are no trailblazers that have faced this path before us to guide and advise for wisdom. It is a wild world right now. Although times continue to be challenging for both leaders and staff, many nonprofits have responded creatively and strategically to keep their finances on track. As in 2023, Most nonprofits experienced either a balanced budget or a surplus in the most recently completed fiscal year, and the majority anticipate breaking even or having a surplus this fiscal year. So, to break that down, more specifically, 68% of nonprofit leaders reported a balanced budget or a surplus in the last fiscal year. And in the current fiscal year, 66% of nonprofit leaders are anticipating a balanced budget or a surplus. This picture is, however, a little more complex when we look at those who responded to our survey in both 2023 and 2024. Those repeat responders were slightly more likely to indicate they'd had a prior year deficit in this year's survey than in last year's survey. And it remains to be seen whether this is a longer term trend. Now, shifting gears to our final key finding, how are funders doing in their support of nonprofits in 2024? The majority of nonprofit leaders report that funders are maintaining or making new commitments to change their grant-making practices, including reducing funding restrictions or streamlining processes. More specifically, you'll see here that over half of nonprofit leaders report either new or continued commitments to change in 4 key areas of funder practice: providing more multi-year financial support, streamlining or revising reporting requirements, streamlining application and proposal processes, and reducing or eliminating funding restrictions. In contrast, though, nonprofit leaders indicate that funders have more work to do on advancing racial equity. Over a third of nonprofit leaders report that their funders either have no commitments to advancing racial equity or have reduced or ended their commitments in the last year. You'll see in this chart that nonprofit leaders are having a wide range of experiences with funders' racial equity commitments, meaning that there's plenty of room to reflect and build on the other changes in practice that funders are making. So, what is the state of nonprofits this year? Here are the key takeaways. Burnout remains top of mind for nonprofit leaders across the country, both for themselves and their staff. Most nonprofit leaders report balanced budgets or surpluses in the last fiscal year, and the majority of nonprofit leaders are seeing new or continued efforts from their funders to change grant-making practices. CEP's State of Nonprofits will return in 2025 to track trends over time. In the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to the panel to talk about the results that I've just shared.
Alicia, thank you so much. And I'll introduce myself and say I'm Phil Buchanan. I'm moderator of this panel, president of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and would love to invite the panelists to join. Alicia, would love for you to stay on, actually, because we're not done with your perspectives yet. So would love to include you in this conversation. And maybe we can also just stop the screen share so that we can all be on together. That's perfect. Thank you so much. So we are really fortunate to have with us today Beth Brown, who is Managing Director of Mental Health and Well-Being at the Arthur Blank Family Foundation. Previously, she also served as President CEO for the Community Foundation of Sonoma County. And I mentioned that because she might resonate with some of that data on leaders' concerns about their own burnout. Gloria Correll is President and CEO of the Parent Institute for Quality Education. And Tim Delaney is President and CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits. And if you don't know, you should know that that's the largest network of charitable nonprofits in North America. I would also say Tim, who has been just a tireless champion for nonprofits in his role there since 2008, is in the final days of his tenure before retiring. So it's really fun to be able to tap into your knowledge, Tim, before you leave us. So there's a lot here, obviously, in what Alicia shared, and she's going to share a little bit more about how funders are responding to issues of well-being at nonprofits. a bit later in this conversation. But I wondered, Beth, given the work that you do at the Blank Family Foundation, focused on mental health, before we really get into the particulars of the challenges for nonprofits, if you could paint the picture a bit about mental health broadly in this country and the moment that we're in. And as I ask you to do that, I would also say, and don't read it now because then you won't be listening to Beth, but Beth has a great blog post that's just up on our blog today about this issue. But if you could hit on some of the issues, Beth, that you mentioned in that blog post, I think that would just help ground us.
Sure. Well, thank you, Phil and team, for having me and for this research. And it's an honor to be on this panel with Tim and Gloria. And I think in getting into the conversation about mental health and well-being, of which burnout is a part of, and we'll be talking, I know in our conversation, a lot about the organizational level and the sector level, but this is so personal. 100% of people have mental health. So that means all of us, that are participating today. So in that, I'd just like you to take a moment, to take a breath or to do something that really grounds you here. These conversations and kind of getting into this data are very heady, and burnout and mental health and well-being really live in our bodies. And I think normalizing that kind of conversation is part of what we can do as funders. And when we, step back and look at the state of mental health in America, I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone participating that we are in a mental health crisis. According to the National Alliance for Mental Illness, 1 out of every 5 people is experiencing a mental health challenge. And just to say about that, it's many times invisible. So this doesn't mean, 1 out of 5, those are the 20% of the people you aren't seeing. It could be 20% of the people participating today. The Surgeon General, who's been a real leader in calling out mental health as a public health crisis, including just on Friday, he issued a challenge to put a public health warning on social media apps, and we can, talk about the role of technology and nonprofit burnout as well. But he's also called out but workplace mental health as a public health challenge, and citing that 50% of people in America feel lonely right now, and that is as dangerous for your physical health as smoking. So this is just on our society at large. And then I think what we're going to be talking about is adding this layer of how this plays out in the nonprofit workplace, of which there are, more challenges in some ways in terms of being on the front line of trauma and experiencing secondary trauma and direct services, and a lot that we're hearing about work-life balance and pay and ability to do your job. But let me end before I turn it back to Phil on one brighter spot is when the Surgeon General has pillars of what he has said take to make for an effective workplace. And 2 of those pillars, one is mattering at work and having a sense of purpose connected to work. And I know our conversation will talk on the need for more competitive pay, but I do think an asset that the nonprofit sector has is this feeling of mattering at work. And another of the pillars is a feeling of being part of a community. So although we have a lot to work on and to fund in the nonprofit sector, I do think we have strengths to build on as well when it comes to well-being in the workplace.
Beth, as I listen to you, I wasn't necessarily planning to ask you this, but I actually want to ask you another question before we bring in Tim and Gloria. One of the reflections I had during the pandemic was that we were, because we had to be, talking about mental health at work in a way that we never had before. That was certainly true at CEP, but I've talked to other folks who led organizations during that time, obviously, many of them, and it was similar. And I thought, okay, this might be something good that comes from this, that in fact, it becomes more acceptable in the workplace to discuss these issues, that leaders start to see caring about these issues as part of their role. And I'm curious, whether we think that that's been true, that sort of shift persisted, or did we all just sort of snap back to our old ways of kind of thinking we can just compartmentalize and not discuss these issues at work? Do you have a point of view on that?
I do think COVID provided this, a bright spot in terms of being stigma reduction, in terms of talking about it. So because there was so much mental health challenge, but I would say it wasn't just COVID. And because we have, I think, so many Californians on the call, when I was in Sonoma County, when we had wildfires there, experienced the same kind of thing around stigma reduction during the wildfire, because you'd gone through shared trauma. And I think the same kind of thing in with COVID, and then everyone feeling a comfort level and talking about some things that are already there. There have always been mental health challenges as long as there's been humanity. But more of a permission to talk about it. And another factor I would say is younger generation, that especially, Gen Z, this is a generation that they're growing up and not feeling the same sense of stigma. And I think pushing us older generations to talking about it and doing something about it as well.
Okay, great. And as we move forward with this conversation, I want to say the obvious maybe, but I think it's worth saying that there are so many organizations and resources out there doing work on these issues. And so I think we are hosting this session with Philanthropy California, but we are by no means, the experts here. And so just want to say that there are folks like Independent Sector, which has certainly made nonprofit staffing a priority. National Council on Nonprofits, represented by Tim, who we'll talk to here again, who's done tremendous work on issues related to the nonprofit workforce for years. All the many state association of nonprofits that are doing this work. Philanthropy supporting organizations like Philanthropy California, we heard from Carla earlier, but also many others. Institute for Nonprofit Practice had a great webinar on this issue in March. I'm on their board. They have great resources, so really recommend them. There's the Building Movement projects. These are just examples. It goes on and on. Fund the People. Rusty Stahl, who leads that organization, has been passionate about this issue of really caring for the nonprofit workforce for years, and has helped to build that effort. The Well-Being Project, One Mind at Work. So the list just goes on, and that was by no means exhaustive. But Tim, let's turn to the particular challenges for nonprofits and the issues that nonprofit leaders are facing, the burnout issue that Alicia discussed. What do you see, and why do some of these issues that Beth described become even more challenging in the nonprofit context?
Thanks, Phil, and thanks for having me, and my fellow panelists for your wisdom that you're sharing. I think it's important for us to look at the overall context. So many people that I bump into from private sector and government and other places, there's this assumption that COVID's over, so everything's fine. It's not. It's not fine in that we are still feeling the trauma from the Great Recession. When the Great Recession hit, it hit nonprofits harder than any other group. And it hit governments almost as hard. And state and local governments have been suffering. Economists at the time said that the decade ahead would be known as the lost decade. And indeed, in 2018 and 2019, a third of the states had still not recovered to where they were pre-pandemic. And so a decade was gone, and nonprofits still had not caught up when then COVID hit and just slammed us. And I'm so proud of the way that the nonprofit community rallied, because people were exhausted, and yet they dipped into deeper recesses that they didn't know they had. And sometimes they created them out of whole cloth. and they then weathered through and got through it. But people were still hurting, and there were increased numbers of people still coming to nonprofits. And so it'd been unrelenting. And that is the context in which we're operating. And too many people are assuming that because COVID is no longer forced us to wear a mask, everything's fine and we've snapped back to normal. We still haven't snapped back to pre-2009. And so that's, I think, an important context for then this data, which is what we describe as a crisis. It's the nonprofit workforce shortage crisis. And we have been working on this for several years. And if I can just do a quick segue, because I thought this might help foundations, certainly help nonprofits. If you all adopted something similar, one of our 5 core values here at the National Council of Nonprofits is, quote, nonprofits and their employees should have the respect and the resources needed to get their work done, close quote. If we don't have the resources to get the work done, then we are having to take it out of the hide of our employees, and it just gets worse and worse. And I would also encourage us all to be thinking about drawing the next phase of the alignment. When nonprofits don't have the resources that are needed, they can't deliver to the public what is needed. And so it all goes back to that resources issue. We did our last big nationwide survey in April of 2023. We had more than 1,600 nonprofits responding to it. More than 3 out of 4, 74%, completing the nationwide survey reported that they had job vacancies. Now compare that at the time, 74.6, so let's call it 75%, compared with the Department of Labor said that the for-profit community had vacancies of 33%. And so vacancies among nonprofits are even higher. And why is that? So we asked nonprofits, and they said that they identified the top 3 barriers affecting nonprofit recruitment and retention as number 1, salary competition at 72%. Then budget constraints and insufficient funds at 2/3 at 66%, and burnout and stress at 50%. Look at how those 3 interact, and it's creating, in essence, a death spiral because one thing hits another, and it's starting to fall apart. And I'm watching the nonprofit sector really suffering, and it's certainly the frontline people that are suffering, in part because we're finding we can't hire. That's the hardest position for nonprofits to hire, the frontline positions. Right. And again, that's what impacts the public the most. But it also hurts the leaders because, we were already pulling 24-hour shifts during COVID, during the worst of it, and people are burned out. In our network of more than 50 different state and regional associations of nonprofits, we've had about 50% of our CEOs leave. And some of them stayed on extra long. They were scheduled to go out, but they stayed on and carried through COVID. But there's just been this backlog, and suddenly there's a lot of movement, and especially this last year. And as I look around, I see that turnover is happening in leadership of nonprofits. It's not just our network. I look at other networks. I look at the program officers that we engage with. We've had a complete turnover of our program officers from pre-COVID days. And so you've got to reestablish those relationships. And it's just going on and on and on. It's unrelenting, and people are tired.
Wow. I mean, Tim, that is just an incredible sort of picture that you've painted, a really daunting one. Gloria, you're living this as a CEO of a nonprofit. I'm curious, and I've heard you talk similarly to Tim about the sort of cumulative and almost like compounding effects of crisis after crisis and the toll that it has taken. So what do you see, and what can funders, because this is who we're trying to reach with this conversation, foundations, individual donors, grant-making institutions of whatever kind, do to be helpful in this context?
Well, thank you for the question and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm with Parent Institute for Quality Education. We're a social justice educational equity organization that is national in scope and provide direct services in California. We serve over 25,000 families directly in California. And the reason why that matters is because we are living every day exactly what these statistics mean for families and importantly for the staff. And what I mean by that is, I think there's sort of three really important things that I just want to once again sort of highlight and reiterate from what Tim and Beth have raised. One is that as a direct service organization that does educational equity work and social justice work in communities that are already under-resourced, one of the things that happened, as we all know, that COVID disproportionately impacted communities of color. They were more likely to suffer devastating losses in terms of death, economic hardship, limited access to medical services, health issues, housing issues. And as the trusted community partner, what that has meant is that our team is still not just listening to families experiencing this, the death of the loved one, the grandmother, the dad, the, abuelita, whoever that might be, they're still experiencing that loss. Because we are in the community, 95% of our team had a loved one die during the pandemic, right? And so this is what Tim and Beth allude to, right? Is that cumulative stress of living through the trauma, and I think sort of this other tension that exists with this sense of going back to normal, right? That kids are back in school, therefore things should be back at how we used to engage, right? And I think that tension as a staff member, as a member of the organization, you really are holding both the trauma that families are experiencing and living through, your own, because you're part of that community, but with this tension, I think, about what does that mean? How do I respond to that? We used to have mental health days, literally built into our everyday. We called them huddles. And it was just an open source for people to check in with one another. To your point, Phil and Alicia, earlier, right? That it was built into our work every day. Partially, we were funded to do that. So we had the resources to do that. And those things, right, get shrunk or compressed or aren't available as much. We had a mental health counselor join those huddles in case there were issues that came up that I certainly wasn't in a position as the CEO to respond to, right? I just knew that this was something that was needed. So in my role, I would say, Phil, I think it's really important that we talk about it, that we validate it. This isn't in people's heads. This is really happening. There's a tension to go back to normal. And it's very important for the well-being and that sense of belonging that we don't pretend that those things aren't real or that we should just get over it, right? And I think that really speaks, Beth, to what you were saying about mattering at work. Being seen really matters. And I think it really goes back to what Tim was mentioning about recruiting and retaining. One of the things finishing up with what can funders do, one of the things we know it's so important is that, of course, general operating support grants are critical for sure, right? Yes. And what I would say is that having funders really ask us how we're doing, to include those questions in their applications, in their check-ins with us as grantees, right? Why? Because that elevates the level of discourse and conversation. You know, I think really funding capacity building supports, coaching, mental health, sabbaticals. And I really want to stress the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which, as Alicia mentioned, a lot of our funders have pulled back from that. And I just want to really elevate that, because part of the discussion, especially in our communities and other nonprofit leaders, especially nonprofit leaders of color, is that we then are able to work through some of those conversations, guided and supported by professionals, right? I think this is part of what is really challenging as a CEO, is that we can't be all things, right? And so we really need to be thoughtful about how we support our team by bringing in those added resources. And so really thinking about how our funding partners can support capacity building, thinking about well-being of staff more holistically. Yes, transition planning is very important. Yes, it's important. We just heard the leadership transitions that we're experiencing, but it's also about capacity building by supporting HR, IT. Trust me when I tell you, you do not want me troubleshooting your computer or your IT data systems, right? And yet sometimes we have that role. So finishing up, I think, with Alicia's point about the leaderships of, you know, burnout and how much it has been exacerbated. It's that cumulative effect of sustaining and holding our team with the tensions that exist by some of our funders and the rest of the world really wanting to be done with it, right? And recognizing that there's some capacity building issues that without support, HR, IT, diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are not well positioned to be responsive to the needs of our staff who are holding the trauma, including theirs, in order to serve in a culturally responsive, linguistically responsive, trauma-informed way the communities that we serve. And I think that is the really a jumping off point for continuing the dialogue about how to do that, how to foster that, and how to continue to validate not just the work that CEP and Philanthropy California are doing, but I think the broader sector around the partnership and collaboration that needs to happen.
Yeah, and there's like a backdrop here, I think, of my take would be just insufficient appreciation for the vital role nonprofits play and the challenge of doing that work day to day, that this is the hardest work often, you know, the work on problems that have defied government or market solutions. So we need to pay more, not less attention to the staff, to the workforce. Alicia, you're here obviously in your capacity as our VP for research, and you're presenting really useful data, but I want to invite you to also offer your own take. You have led organizations, including during moments of crises. What is your sort of personal take as you listen to this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of the findings from the data really resonate with my own personal experience as well. I mean, one of the things that it wasn't necessarily on the slide, but I think is worth noting is that when we looked at some of these results, especially for leaders of color, nonprofit leaders who identified as people of color reported that burnout is having a slightly greater impact on their organization's ability to achieve its mission than leaders who were not people of color. And even though it was a small effect size, I think that finding is super important, and it resonates with my own experience, especially in this moment that we're in, where DEI is under attack, where organizations are being, really sought out to individual organizations are being attacked. And so I think, in addition to all that we just talked about, the complexities of a lot of the DEI issues that are in this context right now also make this an especially challenging moment.
Thanks. And we want to turn, I think, now a little bit to, and Gloria started to take us there, what funders should do, what they can do to support greater well-being. Maybe we do that after we hear from Alicia about some data from another little report that we just put out about what they are and aren't doing. So I'm gonna, this is gonna be quick, have us panelists go away for another couple of minutes. Invite Alicia to share that data, and then we'll get into the funder part of this. So we're gonna turn our video off and let Alicia share that information with us. Go ahead, Alicia.
All right, thanks, Phil. So now I'm going to briefly present some other CEP recently released research. It's a research snapshot on how foundations are supporting grantee staff well-being. And this report, which was released just a few weeks ago, kind of as a companion piece to the state of nonprofits, it looks at how foundations are understanding, approaching, and acting on the issue of burnout, and more broadly, nonprofit staff mental health and well-being. And this report also ties back to the first key finding in the State of Nonprofits report about how there is significant concern about burnout at nonprofits. This is our second research snapshot, which is a part of a series of short form research publications designed to answer timely, specific questions relevant to funders. So this study on foundation leaders' thoughts about and responses to grantee well-being was part of a larger research effort that included other topics. This snapshot mostly used data from a CEP survey that was given last year to US-based foundations that provide $5 million or more in annual giving. It also drew nonprofit data from the same survey of the Nonprofit Voice Panel earlier this year, using the State of Nonprofits 2024 report. So out of 829 foundation leaders eligible to respond to the survey, we received completed responses from 283, representing a 34% response rate. Our first key finding is that most foundation leaders report some degree of understanding about the well-being of staff at the organizations they fund. More specifically, we found that levels of understanding of grantee staff well-being differed among foundation leaders. Just under 20% of leaders reported that they had a deep understanding of their grantees' well-being. The second key finding in this report is that the majority of foundation leaders are concerned about burnout among staff at the organizations they fund, which echoes what we heard from nonprofit leaders. One concerning data point from this key finding is that over a third of foundation leaders said they are concerned about staff burnout for most or all of their grantees. Of even more interest, you'll see in the chart displayed on this slide that over 40% of foundation leaders told us that burnout among their grantees has a moderate to significant impact on their foundation's ability to achieve its own mission. Clearly, foundation leaders are seeing some relationship between burnout at the grantee level and mission achievement at the foundation level. For our last key finding, we return to the question of what foundation leaders are doing about the issue of burnout and well-being at their grantee organizations. We found that just about half of foundation leaders are engaging in practices to support the well-being of staff at organizations they fund. Practices varied among funders, but the most common practices we heard from leaders in our survey included asking about staff well-being during check-ins with grantees, providing capacity building grants specifically to support grantees' well-being, and providing knowledge about practices to support well-being to their grantees. If we dig deeper into this data, we found that those 18% of foundation leaders that reported a deep understanding of their grantee staff well-being were almost twice as likely to engage in practices that support well-being for the nonprofits they fund. Now, we don't necessarily know what direction that relationship is working in, but the data does seem to suggest there's a connection between having a really strong understanding of grantees' well-being and the provision of some kind of support to grantees for well-being. To wrap up, our findings suggest that most foundation leaders report some level of understanding about the state of their grantee staff well-being. However, relatively few have a deep understanding. Like the leaders in our nonprofit survey, the majority of foundation leaders we surveyed are also concerned about staff burnout at their grantee organizations. Finally, despite widespread concerns about burnout, we found that half of foundations are currently engaging in practices to support the well-being of their grantee staff. Our hope is that this research snapshot, along with the State of Nonprofits report, can help to shed more light on where nonprofits are with their well-being, finances, and relationships with donors in 2024, as well as provide a jumping off point for continuing this conversation.
Super interesting and helpful, Alicia, and just want to invite the panelists back in. So we see that folks are concerned. Some of them are doing stuff. Some of them don't feel they have, such a deep understanding. So I guess I just want to throw it open to the panel. Like, what should funders be doing? If you had to, Gloria mentioned general operating support, which of course, and I would add to that, you're going to do that the way that we know, and we know this from our research, the way to do it in a way that really matters is to make it multi-year and meaningfully sized. $25,000 single year general operating support grant doesn't accomplish much relative to program support grant, but the six-figure multi-year commitments, unrestricted, those start to make a difference. That's an easy one. There are plenty of reasons why you might give a program restricted grant, but in general, if your goals overlap with the grantee's goals, that's a really, really useful thing to do. But what else? Let's push ourselves. What else would you like to see funders do?
Beth, did you want to go first?
Well, I'll jump in with a few observations, but one of them is that we need to listen more to the nonprofits. I'll start with that. And what I'm reflecting on is that whenever I've had a grantee perception report, the guidance from CEP has been, this is not the answer that your organization needs to do, but this is a snapshot, and now interpret this in ways to do more. And so I do think this calls for us to do deeper listening and ask the nonprofit, community, and maybe it is the voices of the panel along with others, like, what does a reimagining of workplace well-being in the nonprofit sector look like? What does it mean to be, it's some organizations now, we have 4 generations working together. What is the intergenerational kind of cross-cultural solution? How does AI play a role? And so before, I can jump, I don't want to jump to a solution around that piece of it, about the workplace well-being. But on the key things related to the degree to which the overwork is contributing to burnout and the competition around jobs, I do think that calls for funders to inquire more and to be more of an advocate related to compensation. And Jamie Allison has a great blog post, so I'm not gonna steal her words on this because she'll say it better, but I really encourage you to read that because it's really a call for funders to take responsibility of their role related to compensation. I'll stop there. I do believe there are discrete things that are being funded and well-being for sure. And I wonder if that's what the funders are alluded to, if they're paying for sabbaticals or retreats or that kind of thing. But I think it requires a more holistic view of what this crisis is we're really in. Just think about 1/3 of the leaders are saying they are experiencing burnout. That is like a big warning sign, because if any of you know who are or have experienced burnout related to work or otherwise, you can only go so long and then you crash. Your body says, you know what, we have to take a break.
Thanks, Beth. Gloria?
Well, and I just think, Beth, to your point, building on what Alicia said, and that is even more so for leaders of color, right? And then you compound it with less funding generally, as we know, that's also what the data shows, right? Less unrestricted funding for leaders of color or leaders that run nonprofits. So I think there's that, and I think you are so right, Beth, that like really making that a normal conversation actually goes a really long way to acknowledge it, to validate it. I think the other thing, though, that I would invite our colleagues and our funders to think about is thinking about infrastructure more broadly. I really want to kind of pivot back to Tim's point about onboarding, recruiting, and onboarding. part of the stress and the burnout comes from having an opening for 6 months, right? And because you don't have the HR or the IT support, right, then someone else is doing the work, or the work isn't being done. And then how do you report it to the funder who gave you a project specific grant that's about to end, right? So I do think this idea of capacity building and well-being to be inclusive of the recruiting and onboarding and retaining of staff. I will tell you that for the first time, we had a 50% growth in our staff. It's the first time that we actually have a very thoughtful onboarding process for our new staff. And we started doing stay interviews. We went away from doing exit interviews as our only, of course, we do exit interviews, yes, and our stay interviews. What keeps you here? And 9 times out of 10, it's not the money, right? Clearly, we know that we're under-resourced, we're not as competitive. It's that sense of belonging, the fact that they see themselves, our team, not only supporting the community and the mission, but that they themselves, their well-being is something I care deeply about. And I'm not saying, and this is generally, I would say about the leaders, right? Is that you are asking how I'm doing. You care that I want to stay here and that I want to grow, right? And so I would say that as we think about capacity building more broadly, I think these ideas of helping, through funding and just expertise around HR and IT make a difference for recruiting. And then the actual onboarding and HR support so that you can develop that process. It took us a year. We're very proud of that onboarding process now. And adding, for example, that stay interview component in order for this retention that Tim mentioned, right, is such a vital part of once you bring or you have great talent, to keep them by creating a sense of belonging and also of caring and being seen in the workplace so that they can continue to do the really difficult work that happens in the community that, like I said, I wish others were doing, right? But when we are that last source of support, there's that sense of we have a responsibility to be here, to be a community.
I love the stay interview concept. We've done some of that here, and and of course I can imagine the organizations that have a staff of 10 thinking, how do we do that? It's all of these issues are connected, right? So how do funders provide support such that folks can invest in the infrastructure needed to do things like that great practice that you described, Gloria. And the other thing that keeps going through my head is we keep talking about leaders, and we're also talking about frontline staff and pay equity issues, and the focus needs to be on all of the above, right? Not just one. There was somebody, and I'm starting to look at the questions and bring those in. Somebody said something to the effect of it's not just about leaders going on retreats while the staff, are left to work, so just the way this all connects. Tim, I think you're in this period that I've sort of imagined in my own career where you're about to retire, so you can just say exactly what you think. So invitation to say exactly what you want to say to funders.
Thanks. I may reserve that for later because I want to just jump on something Gloria said to really put the perspective of the pain that nonprofits are feeling right now and that's driving the burnout. We here at the National Council of Nonprofits were instrumental in getting Congress to include explicitly nonprofits being eligible for $350 billion that Congress allocated to state and local governments. And we were able to get Congress to say, and they can spend it on charitable nonprofits. We were invited by the Boston City Council to go up and provide some testimony on some things that they could do. And just listening to the stories from others, nonprofits in Boston was critical to my own analysis. And that was, they were trying to get the city to increase the amount that they would reimburse nonprofits for the work that nonprofits were doing when governments hired them. A little known fact that I wish funders appreciated more is that charitable nonprofits earn a third of our revenue from government grants and contracts. In contrast, we get about 4% of our revenue from foundations. And so we get a whole lot more from government. Can you imagine when government stuff goes down and as is being proposed, that there's no, we're going to cut taxes for you. We're going to cut taxes for you. That is scary talk for it's existential talk for nonprofits. But back to the city council, that they were talking about how the city would only pay $13.65, and they could use their ARPA money to increase that amount. And these leaders were talking about how they had staff who had master's degrees, that the city would only reimburse the nonprofit at $13.65, who are then taking public transit on their way home and seeing billboards from Hobby Lobby and Target saying, we'll pay you $20 an hour and a sign-up bonus. And then a week later, $25,000 and a sign-up bonus. It's just crazy. And so for the small nonprofit, you needed 15 to do the work, but you've always been staffed at 10 or 11. So you're already in a deficit. And then you have somebody leave because they're burned out. And then you have somebody else leave because they are attracted to a higher wage somewhere else. And suddenly you have a staff of 7 doing what had been done by 10 or 11, but you needed 15 to get done right in the first place. That's why people are exhausted. And that's why some of the big investments on infrastructure of these organizations is so critical. And I don't want to dismiss that. But let me share with you another thing that's possible. And that is, we had a great foundation gave us a major grant. They recognize that we know our state association better than they will ever know or anybody else will ever know. And so where could the dollars best be spent if they gave it to us and then we could allocate to try to help them? And so we've been doing that, and we've come up, and it's a pilot program, and it's just working so wonderfully. So more foundations come on in. But one of the examples is the very first program we designed. We have 7, but the first one we designed is, we call it Thrive. And for every state association, they can get up to $500 per FTE that we will then give them to a cap of 4,000. So it's not a lot of money, but it's there to use it for wellness. And of course, they all say, well, what do we need to do? And so on. We're like, the sky's the limit. And we came up with a list of 20 different things they could do. And what are they using it for? The primary thing is to come together. I look at my friends who are program officers who are exhausted at different times of the year because they've been on a trip that's gone through several major cities over the course of several months. As they're traveling around and they see each other and they're all together. Nonprofits don't have a travel budget. If you have 10 employees, you don't have a budget to do a retreat. You don't have those resources. And so what are our people doing? They're putting together some retreats for their own employees. They're having specialists about burnout coming in and talking with them. They're being creative. And that's what the power of what someone said earlier, and that's listen more. Because what we're doing is saying, we don't want to dictate what you have to do. We just care. Well, we're getting comments back from staff of the state associations who are saying, this was transformative. You've changed my life. You've changed my working relationship with my colleagues, et cetera, and so on. It can be powerful. Yes, we need to make the big investments, but you can also make smaller ones that are labeled for wellness and give them the discretion to use it.
Okay, so I want to pick up on the last thing you said, because that speaks directly to a question that was submitted by someone on the webinar, which is what can a smaller foundation that might not be able to make a big multi-year grant do? And I think you just answered it, right? You could actually designate some smaller grants for these hard to fund important areas. We're going to do lightning round here. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to ask for one of you to answer, and then I'm going to move on to the next one. There's a question here that I thought was provocative that somebody submitted, that along the lines of, look, we all look at the 990s and we look at what the highest paid staff are. Should funders be asking about the pay of the lowest paid staff as an entree into a conversation about whether that is where it needs to be? One volunteer to answer that one. Would that be a good practice?
I will say yes. And it's, I think, a recognition that the wage disparity is real. And I hope it would be an opportunity to discuss, not to chastise, not to shame people for doing that, but to really begin a dialogue of what would it take? How can we help? In order for that to happen, obviously you can't make salary adjustments. We just finished our budget. You can't make salary adjustments on a one, without understanding the multi-year commitment that you're making. But Phil, do I think as a nonprofit CEO that asking about salaries and salary wage gaps is important? Absolutely. As long as the conversation is, how do we address it? How can we partner? What would it take?
And at the same time, look at how much you're paying your own people. How about a little bit of parity? Because these people on the front line, they are dealing with things that nobody else wants to deal with. And we need to be helping them. And so for funders to come in, whether it's private foundations or whether it's government, and say, we're only going to pay no more than this amount for someone to do a job. It's like, wait a minute. That A, that's more of a management decision. B, we got pay equity issues internally. And C, that it's none of your business. But it is your business to make sure that you're providing enough that is fair and gives nonprofits the resources and the respect they deserve.
Thanks. I'm going to ask this one to Beth, and I'm going to paraphrase here. But it relates to something you said about listen more and better, basically. And you kindly mentioned CEP's grantee perception report as one way to do that. But that's not something that folks are doing every day, nor should they. And the question in the Q&A really gets to the dynamic or pressure that exists if I'm a grantee of yours, which I actually am, Beth. I mean, we are, CEP is, to tell you that all is well. We're good. No, think burnout, that's not an issue here. I'm not tired. No, and nor is our staff, right? How do you, in your role as a funder, break that barrier and somehow make it possible for me to be more candid than I maybe think I can be when I'm trying to get another grant from you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think a few things. First, if you're not talking about mental health and well-being in your own foundation with your staff closest to you, you're probably going to have a challenge talking about it to anyone else. So one thing that I'd encourage funders to do is to become mental health literate. There are trainings you can take. Some of these, conversations around well-being, it's not just saying like, how are you? But I think it is related to trust building and also the privileged position a funder is in. So I think learning how to listen in a way, and this report can help with that conversation, actually, to say, I know that 95% of leaders, are thinking about burnout. So I think you're likely, one of them. Let's have a conversation about this. But it also, to pick up on Gloria's point, I think funders need to approach it with the language of what would it take? What would it look like if your whole team was operating with a sense of work-life balance? What would it take for you to retain your staff for the next 3 years? To have it in a way that promotes that kind of listening and thinking, and also just to again assume that one out of every 5 people you're interacting with is having a challenge. So really sitting with that, and once I really started to use that as a lens, I couldn't kind of unsee it. So I think there is a mind shift to make too. And I hope one thing that the funders are coming away with from this call or reading the report are that no matter what your strategic areas of interest are, mental health and well-being and burnout are one of your issues if you care about nonprofit capacity.
Thanks, Beth. And I keep thinking of your colleague who's the CEO of the Blank Family Foundation, Faye Tversky, who often says in different contexts, it's both the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. And it is the right thing to care about human beings' well-being, but it is also the smart thing in terms of actually making progress toward shared goals. I'm going to offer you each literally 30 seconds, because that's all we've got time for, to say one thing you're hopeful about with respect to this issue of burnout and nonprofit well-being broadly. One thing that gives you hope, and we'll go Gloria, Alicia, Tim, Beth. Put you on the spot, Gloria.
No worries. I couldn't find the unmute button. So what gives me hope, I would say, are 3 things. One is that we're talking about it. I do think that you're doing the research. We're here today, and that is hopeful. I'm the optimist here, like so many of you. The second thing is that the recognition then leads to a dialogue about what is already working. Some of you, I've been reading the questions, are doing multi-year grants. You're talking to others about doing this. So that as the person receiving, I would say that gives me hope, is the fact that this is happening, that many of you are thinking about it in this context. And I will tell you the third thing that gives me a lot of hope is clearly the staff, the people that I engage with every day, my incredible team, and the younger people that are coming into the field. There are fewer of them, yes, but their commitment and their dedication to push our envelope, to say, listen, I want work-life balance and I'm 24. I never thought I could say that. I'm like, you keep piling work on me and I'm going to keep doing it, because that was the mantra. So that gives me hope, is the fact that we're starting with nonprofit professionals and younger people who are valuing that work-life balance and who are going to reinvent the sector, because that's who they are and that's what their expectations are. So all those 3 things give me hope.
Love those. Thank you. Alicia.
Yeah, what gives me hope is that in the well-being snapshot, actually, at the end of it, we list several resources that already exist that people can use. And so for me, that's super exciting, because one, people are thinking about this and they're actively trying to do something about it. I think the work the Well-Being Project is doing, actually bringing funders together to talk about this more comprehensively. Now, some of the other organizations that have been mentioned on this call are doing really powerful work. And so I think the fact that this conversation is happening and that there are folks who are doing something, not just talking about it, is also super hopeful too.
Thank you, Alicia. Totally agree. Tim.
Just picking up on Gloria's point of people talking about it. It is bringing it front and center. For example, we used part of that grant money I referred to for a program called Convene, where we brought the CEOs of the state associations together because so many of them are new and have never met. And we had some experts come in, talk about well-being. When we do our confab, where all of our network comes together next week, we're again on both days doing a lot about mental illness and well-being. And so it is now front and center, and the opportunity to deal with it. There is a clash ahead, and that is we do have the younger generation that bless them, that they're doing the right thing by saying, I want to have work-life balance. But you can't have work-life balance if you don't have enough resources to support the organization, because the work won't get done. And so we need to support the younger people that are calling for the right thing, but that means that they've got to have the resources to pull it off.
Thank you, Tim. Totally. Beth.
One thing that gives me hope is that there are many more foundations, and I think especially family foundations, coming forward and making mental health a priority grant making area to help address the mental health crisis in communities. And I think if we could turn that same level of compassion and care for also the caring of the nonprofit sector's mental health and well-being, there's some momentum for doing that. And I hope all the funders on here are going to join that movement.
That's great. And what gives me hope is that we've seen that in a moment of crisis, funders can really shift and make dramatic changes in how they work. We've documented that at CEP, both by tracking what foundations tell us they're doing, but also, to Alicia's point about the nonprofit experience with funders, even continuing to shift from the nonprofit perspective. Tim, did you have a last word before I bring Sarah back?
Yeah, I wanted to just reclaim the
20
time that you had
seconds.
offered. The two things. One, I want all foundation people to know that of all the leaders of philanthropy serving organizations are out there, no one has done a better job than Phil Buchanan of talking about nonprofits,
I'm
the
gonna have to
importance
mute
of
you.
them.
It's too nice.
And really, he has been a champion. I've wondered at times whether he's the president CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits. Thank you, Phil. That having been said, now let me move to something else, which is the data. The data that has been presented, it talks about 239 responses from organizations with the average size budget of 5.7, which places them in the top 3% of all nonprofits in the country. And 41% are education, which have heavier foundation support. And it's okay to have a report internally for CEP audiences, but when it is heralding and blowing up and talking about how, and I quote, the second key finding is most nonprofits experienced either a balanced budget or a surplus this year. We eat that stuff when we go to Congress and state legislatures when we're trying to renew the charitable giving incentive that is on the table to be taken away. So please make sure that we're not overstating things this next year when so much is critical. And it's not just CEP, it's everybody. And again, said with all love, all respect, but grave shared concern for nonprofits.
Point very much taken, and I hope we are clear, and I know that Alicia and I have tried to be clear that this is a representative sample of those organizations that receive some foundation funding, which is very different than the sector broadly. Take your point, Tim, and always love the critique. And you wrote a great blog post raising some of those issues about our report a year ago. We are literally over time now. Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you to a great panel. Thank you to Alicia and the research team at CEP for all your great work. Sarah Martin.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to you all for joining us. I just wanted to bring our discussion to a close and mention that you'll be receiving a survey in your inbox. If you have not already, we'd so appreciate you taking 2 minutes to fill it out. It really helps us. And just as a reminder, we will send out a recording of the webinar in the next week or so, including links to the resources we discussed today. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.